And yet what the government are planning in their white paper is to introduce a change in the law, which would mean rather than having regard to, chief constables have a duty to fulfil the priorities set out by the Home Secretary. Not local governance, but just the Home Secretary will be able to direct police resourcing much more than has ever been envisaged. And because it's in the popular zeitgeist, the Home Secretary has talked about taking back control of policing. No Home Secretary has ever had this level of control over policing since Robert Peel introduced the Metropolitan Police. I think it's something we should be really concerned about.
Well, hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Anglosphere show. It's a real pleasure to welcome Matthew Barber, PCC, Police and Crime Commissioner for the Thames Valley, one of the largest police authorities in England, responsible for police funding, responsible for the operational capacity of the police, appointing the Chief Constable and making sure we are kept safe. And it's wonderful to have you on the show, Matthew.
Absolute pleasure.
And most of all, Matthew is a wonderful Conservative colleague as well. So as a county councillor, we chat a lot about how we can really crack down on crime, improve neighbourhood policing. And I know you've done so much in the Farnhams and Stoke Poges ward in Buckinghamshire and many other parts of the Thames Valley area. So thank you for your service.
No, it's been a pleasure. It's a fascinating role, which of course this government are looking to abolish in a couple of years' time. But that's only part of the government's reform agenda for policing, which I think has big implications for the public.
Absolutely. And the scrapping of the PCCs is going to see a decrease in democratic accountability. I understand there's going to be what is replaced by a squabbling committee of party political council leaders instead of one point of contact, strong leadership saying this is what the police should be doing. Is that right?
Yeah, it's very similar to the old police authority model. It's going to be council leaders. They will then appoint someone else who will do my job day to day. So you'll still have one person, but it's really not clear. And I've been in meetings with representatives from the Home Office this morning. It's not clear whether that is a political person or whether it's an officer person. And I think it does make a big difference. Certainly if it's a political appointee across somewhere like Thames Valley, it will be very interesting to see how the politics of that appointment goes, because we have different shades of political complexion across Thames Valley, and if there are weighted votes, how will the government choose to weight those votes for different councils to deliver that appointment? And of course, if it's someone who is a council officer, effectively, who is appointed by those leaders, that relationship then becomes very different between that person and the Chief Constable in the holding to account if they don't actually have a political mandate of any kind. It
sounds very similar to what the Liberal Democrats and Labour are doing to the Buckinghamshire Fire Authority, where they're ramming through these changes to essentially give all the powers to officers and decrease the accountability of such, and decrease the powers of the chairman of the authority, which I suppose is the fire equivalent of your position.
Yes, it's sort of the nearest comparator, and it is, the accountability is really important. I don't have operational control over Thames Valley Police. I don't want to. That's the Chief Constable's job. And there is a really clear line. For those people who are nervous about police and crime commissioners politicising policing, that's absolutely not been the case. And I don't think you could point anywhere in the country where any PCC of any complexion has tried to go down that route. But it is important, I think, that there is some accountability. And because the Chief Constable is operationally independent, and you don't want them to be elected, and you don't want them to be under sort of political pressures that might come to bear elsewhere, it's really important to have someone who is elected, who can set forward a plan on behalf of the public, who can challenge the police, and ultimately, if you don't like what I do, you can get rid of me at the ballot box. That's really fundamental. It's one of those things that is really challenging, I think, in terms of what the government are talking about for the future.
Absolutely, and obviously talking about the white paper, which you've just had some meetings about, of course, we're seeing what is quite a reduction in police operational capacity, if I'm right in saying the effectiveness of police delivery, the reduction of police powers. We see, that this government doesn't seem to take policing seriously.
I think there's a real risk. The rhetoric doesn't always seem to match the action. So I was talking to the people from the Home Office today, reiterating the Home Office line that this is all about local policing and local communities. And yet in Thames Valley, as a local force, we've had £9 million less than we were expecting. Our new police officers that we're looking to recruit for neighbourhood teams are only 40% funded now by the Home Office. And yet this year alone, £99.3 million is being held back by the Home Office for their centralisation and police reform. So undoubtedly, I think there are some big changes at the national level that will be really good for policing. the way we tackle fraud, for example, needs a complete overhaul. So the creation of the National Police Service is not fundamentally a bad idea, but the way that the government are rolling this out, with that lack of accountability from local governments, the potential, I think this is the really big one, which is the potential for forced mergers. So the Home Secretary has talked about regional police forces. So it might be at the extreme end, but that could look like the abolition of forces like Thames Valley Police and the introduction of a southeast police force, everything from Milton Keynes to Margate. It would have the population around the size of Slovenia, bigger than London, but with a smaller police force to manage it. Those things are really worrying. But the thing that I suppose pretty fundamentally as a matter of principle worries me the most is that at the moment the Chief Constable has to have regard to my plan as Police and Crime Commissioner, but it's really important I can't direct him. And that's the same with the Home Secretary. The Chief Constable has to have regard to instructions coming from the Home Office, but he's operationally independent. And I think it's really important. It's part of that fundamental bit of British policing, the stuff that Robert Peel introduced when he introduced the Metropolitan Police, that independence from political interference.
Completely. And to talk about Robert Peel, and of course, is the Anglosphere show, the importance of the English-speaking nations. Now, the English-speaking nations were all inspired by the British policing model. And before we had Peel constables, we had the parish constable. That was a volunteer role. They had quite a few powers within their own parish. It seemed that society policed itself through a social contract, and then when Peel introduced the police in the Metropolitan Police, when it was harder to govern those inner urban industrialised areas compared to the sleepy English village, it was really interesting to see that they were unarmed. It was very much, again, policing by consent. They weren't dressed like a soldier, but they were dressed formally, and throughout many years, people knew their local bobby. And neighbourhood policing was something where it wouldn't be an uncommon sight to see a policeman on a bicycle, and it would be a very localised thing. Whereas in America we see the police is very militarised, and in Europe and other parts of the world, the gendarme system in France, of course, which is almost every European country has a gendarmerie, which is under obviously their Ministry of Defence, but we don't have a gendarmerie. We only have we used to have a yeomanry, but that was a bit different, but not anymore. So do you fear the government especially is pushing a drift to super forces? We're seeing the creation of a British FBI, even though there's the National Crime Agency. I thought that was the equivalent. Are we seeing a push from what is the English-speaking the Anglosphere model, and towards very much a European gendarme/American? I
don't know. I don't know. There's a deliberate drive to do that, and a lot of this drive for change actually comes from within policing, from senior police officers. But I do think that is the danger of the drift. That perhaps losing some of those core principles. So policing by consent sounds very quaint. And I was talking to a group of school last night, actually, about building trust in communities. And actually, despite some of the big headlines we've seen about failings in policing over the last 5 or 10 years, fundamentally, that policing by consent really matters. It's getting the basics right in your community, having our neighbourhood police officers where they know their communities. And it's quite interesting. We all often hear the cry when we never see the police around here anymore. Actually, I know from my work with local officers, they are, of course, we'd like to have more of them, but they are on the ground on a daily basis, and they know the ne'er-do-wells. They know the difficult characters, just like police officers did a generation before and generation before that. They are dealing with those difficult families, those difficult individuals, day in and day out, trying to get them to court, dealing with the long-term problem solving around some of the issues they cause. They really do know their community, and proper old-fashioned policing is alive and well in many ways if people want to stop and take a look. But there is a real risk that we do drift to something which sounds a little bit more exciting, a little bit sexier for some. We talk about serious organised crime. I think it's a really good place to start the conversation. Serious organised crime is a big issue. It does need some high-end tactics, which are not always available to local officers on the ground. But serious organised crime isn't just the thing that happens online or in the big cities. It happens across society. So one of the things we've done in Thames Valley is the creation of our Rural Crime Task Force. And this is a team that will go after people with hair coursing, stealing plant and machinery, GPS units from tractors. To a lot of people, this seems like really basic, boring, boring yokel crime, a few bits of plant and machinery, bit of damage to crops. That's very 19th century, isn't it? Actually, we know that this is really quite sophisticated, serious organised crime, that the equipment and vehicles that are stolen will often be trafficked across Europe within a few days or weeks. And actually, the investigations have led to work with the French, with the FBI, and there's millions of pounds worth of equipment being recovered. So yes, of course, understanding the sophistication of modern criminals matters, but fundamentally it's about stuff that happens in local communities. It's still about having those officers on the ground who know their patch, who can talk to the farmers, who understand raw crime, who know their villages, who know their towns. And so those basics of British policing by consent, rather than a big high-tech militarised, to use that term, force that can just swoop in to deal with something when it happens, long-term prevention of crime is much more about that local footprint.
Absolutely. And I suppose it's known as the broken windows theory, that if you tackle smaller crime at a lower level, like shoplifting, and I know you've done a lot of work with improving shoplifting deterrence, for example, was it the Link app you brought in for kind of centralising all the CCTV to ensure that we can tackle shoplifters. But a lot of my residents, it's the same thing. They like to see presence, but there's a lot of things obviously they don't see behind the scenes. And I'm very grateful to you for organising a shadowing of a neighbourhood police officer, which was really eye-opening, and to see the challenges and the work policing does, and you can see why a lot of police officers now feel like they can't just be constantly on foot on a high street. They have to be mobile as well, and the challenges they face. And it feels like this super centralisation is going to only make that worse, because you're going to have, I suppose, police resources. It's going to become that reactive search and destroy where they'll pull into one area. And for example, Thames Valley Police, you've got huge urban areas like Slough, and you've got Reading, and then you've got the more rural villages like in my ward that are kind of, they're not overlooked, but they're not it's not the crime hotspots. So some residents think, oh well, where are the police? But it's because you have to kind of prioritise with the resources the police have.
I think you're right. There is no perfect solution to this, but there must be a sweet spot somewhere between being too small, where you don't have the capabilities to respond to the changing nature of crime, because crime is getting more sophisticated and we are at more risk online than we ever have been before. But also too big can be too remote and can lose the ability to deal with what some people might call traditional crime, vehicle crime, burglary,
yes,
which are thankfully falling, but they still happen. If they happen to you, they really impact on people's lives. So we need to have a really strong and tough approach. So there is a sweet spot to be found. I wouldn't reject all of the government's proposals around police reform, but I think that is one of the ones that really does worry me, because if we get that wrong, if we get the size of police forces wrong, then we become much more remote and therefore much more removed from communities. And you touched on yourself about the unarmed nature of policing. I think Britain is probably about one of only 2 or 3 countries now that have routinely unarmed police officers. Some people say that's quaint and old-fashioned and we should protect our police officers more, but actually, although police officers will and frankly always have faced violence, I do think that's a really important part of our policing model, because it does make the police much more approachable. It emphasises the fact that actually police officers have no more power over you or I than another citizen. They can lawfully detain you, but I can lawfully detain you if you're committing a crime.
Yes.
They are, to use those Peelian principles, just citizens in uniform.
Yes.
And again, that is vitally important in
yes.
terms of how we see our policing in the future. There was an example, if you'll indulge me for a moment, given by one of our former chief constables in Thames Valley, who was involved with a chap who I think had come over as a refugee from Iraq, and he was during the time when Saddam Hussein was in control, and this individual was sadly going to try and kill himself, and this officer was trying to talk him down, and he got talking about, well, why did you come to the UK? He said, well, I was reading a magazine in my village about how the police in the UK don't have guns.
Yes.
And I thought, what a wonderful place that must
yes.
be, that they
yes.
don't carry guns, because
yes.
there are plenty of places in the world where the police are seen as a sign of oppression by the state, not as a sign of safety. And I take great comfort, in fact, that the biggest complaint I get from the public, and probably always will, because I don't think we'll ever satisfy demand, is, well, we want to see more police. We want to see the police around here. Why aren't there more police officers? That's something I would love to be able to satisfy that desire for. But frankly, that's a much better position than some parts of the world where people say, I'm scared of the police. I don't want to see the police around here. I'm worried that the police are here. So we can't ignore that. And that's a huge benefit of our model of policing.
And I think that freedom is a fundamental tenet of our nation through our constitution. And we exercise that through, again, it goes back to policing by consent. I think, obviously, this has come up recently, huge criticism of Starmer at the moment regarding freedom of speech and the importance of freedom of expression. And we've seen many cases where the police have handled this amazingly, where they've had to deal with very difficult situations, whether it be protests, whether we're seeing Palestine Action, a prescribed terror organisation, facing increased sectarianism. Policing are having to almost arbitrate between different cultural groups. I mean, the challenges are huge. So, if you were a Home Secretary, what policing reform would you like to see? Am I right in saying non-crime hate incidents have been scrapped as well, or going to be scrapped?
They're going to be, and I think that's part. So I think one of the things that I would do, and I've looked with colleagues, and I think we probably need to update some of the malicious communications legislation, which was just not designed for our online world.
Yes.
And I think we do need to be really careful, because there are some malicious communications which are really serious and really offensive, and often domestic abuse cases will be charged as malicious communication, because these are threats and intimidation and harassment aimed at vulnerable women who have tried to leave relationships.
Absolutely.
And there's some really serious threats involved in that. So we can throw the baby out with the bathwater is the risk. I think the biggest challenge we have, and I don't quite know, it's certainly not something we can legislate for, but it is a real challenge, is looking at how we try to reintroduce civility to some of our debate. A lot of the things that I see that come into the policing world, frankly, in my view, didn't ought to be matters for the police. But that's not me saying that I think they don't matter. There are lots of offensive comments that people can make. I might agree with the principle of what someone is supporting, but I might think you're making that in a very offensive and unnecessarily rude way. We all need to think about how we moderate our speech, and that's not about censorship or restricting people's freedom of speech. It's about how we communicate with each other in a civilized fashion. Discussions like this, I think, are really important, where people can agree or disagree. And
but
we do a lot less of that, and far too much gets pushed to the law, which frankly shouldn't be.
It seems like society should police itself on that.
Yes,
not the law.
I mean, you touched on when you talk about the old village bobby, that prior to the Metropolitan Police, when you might have had a parish constable, there was a lot more self-policing.
Yes.
I don't think that's a bad thing. I think you could look at that beyond just freedom of speech. There are a lot of things that the police get drawn into these days.
Yeah.
Neighbour disputes, which frankly are not really things for the police.
No.
In some cases, it is very clear that no law has been broken. In other cases, there might be a technical breach of the law, but actually is sending someone before the courts the right and proportionate approach. And they are things that I think a generation or two ago, even that recently, nobody would have even thought about calling the police. It doesn't mean that we should tolerate poor behaviour or difficult neighbours. It doesn't mean that we should take the law into our own hands and become vigilantes. But there would have been a way of dealing with it by having a grown-up conversation with someone, neighbours and friends exerting a bit of pressure on what was acceptable social behaviour. And I think it's some of those little bits. I don't want to say that it's the fabric of society breaking down, because that sounds far too dramatic, because I see so many good aspects of society that still exist.
You're a half-full man.
I am always a glass half-full man. But I do think that is one of those things that has perhaps shifted, that we don't necessarily have that level of self-regulation.
And I think it wouldn't. I wouldn't be lying if I would say we live in a low trust society. We're in a situation where there is increased mistrust between individuals, and there seems to be a decline in responsibility both personal, familial, and also collective responsibility when it comes to, all the way from volunteering. For example, South Butts Wombles, we formed a volunteer litter pick group because we're absolutely fed up with people chucking crap out of their cars. The fly tipping, the complete lack and complete absence of responsibility when people think that is okay. And ultimately, the police cannot enforce every single litter crime because for years and years, and if you go to Singapore, for example, use a very Anglosphere model of high trust society, which we used to have, it was considered verboten to do that. And now it's like, well, each to yourself, I don't really trust society. It dislikes me. I'm just going to do what I want.
Yeah. The council have got someone who's paid to pick that for me. So
it's someone else.
I don't need to.
It's someone else's. How do we restore across the Anglosphere, and especially the United Kingdom, a high trust society where people have a part to play, responsibility, and how can policing be introduced?
So I think responsibility is the key, and I think one of the I'm not sure. I wish I had a complete solution for this. I'd be a much better person if I had the absolute answer for you. But I do think part of it, or at least the thing to resist more, is the over-regulation that we see. Something bad happens. And there's an inquiry, and we jump to we must have some new piece of regulation or new rule or law for us to prevent that from ever happening again. In the idea that it's going to keep us safer, and I think one of the risks of that is that actually that lowers trust, because I now no longer have to trust that you'll do the right thing. I expect some third party to enforce our behaviour. Therefore, I don't really trust you.
Yes.
And because I don't trust you, we need to have that thing. So you take volunteering groups for all the right reasons, and I don't doubt people's good intent in introducing these rules over the years. But probably even for that sort of local volunteer group, people end up getting DBS checked.
Yes.
And you have safeguarding,
insurance,
a safeguarding link.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, it's just a few people who want to go and pick up some litter.
So from experience, when we started this group, it was only like 3 of us, and we wanted to be proactive and take action against littering. The first thing was we got a bit of, are you insured for that? Health and safety. We just say it's your own. If it's your own responsibility. If you want to do this, if you generally want to do this, you do this at your own risk. Everyone's happy, and people are like, yeah, of course I want to do it. And if someone wants to collect a 50 miles per hour road, I can't rugby tackle them.
Yeah,
I can't. And it's a society now where for example, let's take in Oxfordshire, the huge fly tip we saw, it was near, which town was it?
Near Killington.
Indeed. And we saw what was a huge absence of responsibility, not only from those who did it, but from the Environment Agency, who said, just don't touch it. Oh, it's too much of a risk. It's like a health risk to touch it. It's not a health risk to just let it fester in a field.
No, absolutely.
It just seems like this is the psychology of how
I think
government works.
We have, again, often for the right intentions, but we've over-regulated, become so risk-averse in so much of what we do. Litter picking is a great example at the small level. I can think of hundreds of others where actually the low trust, which you're absolutely right, we do have in society, I think is actually not helped. Often people say, we have low trust, therefore we must regulate something more to make sure that we can trust people. Actually, that's not trust. Trust is about a social bargain that says, actually, I'm confident that you will do the thing that you want to do because I think you're a good person, and if you don't, it's probably because there's something that's actually going to prevent you from doing it, rather than you just have complete disregard for me, not because I feel you have to be forced to do that thing because there's a rule and someone's going to enforce that. So it's one of those problems in society which I think has slowed down our national ability to deliver projects, to respond to things, whether it's fly tipping by the Environment Agency, whether it's big national infrastructure projects, whether it's about some of our political debate that gets slowed down, our inability to make decisions. There are lots of things which, even if they are unpopular, even if I disagree with them, I just wish someone would get on, make the decision, and build the damn thing.
Just do it.
Just get on with it. We'll deal with mitigating the harm I might think it's caused afterwards, but just get on with it. And I, the regulation, whether it's in the form of formal regulation, whether it's additional rules, legislation, it breeds that sort of institutional inertia.
Yes.
We say, that sounds like a really good idea, but we're going to have to go through a checklist of things to do before then. And I don't think that helps build trust. I think
Yes.
it actually sort of mitigates against having trust.
It's like big, major infrastructure projects. Look at HS2, the amount of billions of pounds spent before a spade was even put in the ground. People are frustrated that the state no longer works. It asks for more and more money. We see it in our pay slips. It asks for more and more. We're seeing it on income tax. If we're an employer with the employers, NI is seeing it with business rates, with pubs. I mean, everyone's getting hammered, and yet they feel the service they're getting from central government is declining and declining. I mean, how do we stop that? How do we get government back to serving people?
Well, I think that's exactly right, and I think I was writing a piece the other day. Actually, that reminder that public services are there to serve the public, not the public to serve the services, and we see that in a variety of areas. Certainly, some of my local decisions made by my local council, where more bureaucracy is put in the way of local residents just to do this sort of small thing. We had the introduction of an Oxford congestion charge. Which has not pleased those of us outside of the city. It's my city. I may not live there, but it's the city I use. It actually just makes it that little bit more difficult for people. It's not going to ruin anybody's life. It's not going to be a massive barrier to me. But it just makes my life a little bit more difficult and makes the county work a little bit less well. So those are there's the small incremental things, and we do need that change in mindset, which is about delivery that's focused on what residents need, and probably slimming down our ambition. So again, I think there's a public conversation to have, because I think the general public may not be in the same place as where we are on this, but I think we we expect too much of the state. These days, I'm not saying that because I think the state is incapable of doing these things. I just don't think that the state should be doing a lot of these things. So take the litter picking, for example. It's not unreasonable for a local council to pay to have some bins in the high street that they empty. Actually, I think we live in a much better world if people just didn't then chuck stuff out of their cars, and we didn't have to have a very expensive service of councils going around clearing our verges. Because I grew up litter picking. I've got a bag along with the poo bags I take out of my dog to pick stuff up. If we just expected a little bit less from the state, then the state could focus on the things that we do have. There's always a great principle about what should the state do. Well, the state should do those things that individuals cannot deliver on their own. Deliver roads. You and I may well get on very well, but we haven't got the means to organise a nice bit of tarmac between your house in Buckinghamshire and my house in Oxfordshire. We need the state to organise a road network. It's reasonably well accepted that although there might be private alternatives, that most people will accept actually having free healthcare at the point of need is a reasonable thing that most people wouldn't be able to put in place for themselves at the level of provision that we would expect. But there are an awful lot of other things that I can provide for myself that I don't need the state to do for me. But now there is a provision for them doing it, and almost an expectation that they will. And whilst we have that growing expectation of more things being done for us, and less personal responsibility, we have lower trust and rising costs to deliver it.
Now, Matthew, you used to run a council for many years. You know what it's like to be a leader of a council with a huge budget. And a lot of councils at the moment are being squeezed by statutory duties and services, especially county and unitary authorities. So a lot of people say, why are there so many potholes? Why aren't the roads fixed? And what I tell them is, I say, okay, here it is. This is the reason. When you've got 76% of your budgets on adult social care and many important services, may I add, but it contains a huge part of budget, 76% roughly, give or take, from many authorities. And then the rest of that 24% for everything else, all the front-facing stuff that people see. Yep. And people feel and people pay for, which is, of course, potholes. Because, there was one pothole the other day which I think knocked out 4 cars. And they all had to park next door on the pub, and it looked like a repair shop. And it's so frustrating for people. How do we ensure that? Because for me, I think council funding is so flawed, because it seems like central government call the shots. It's not like a federal system where the states can levy income tax. They can choose their budgets, or devolution in Scotland. It feels that councils don't have much leeway. They've become almost mini welfare states, and very little funding for everything else, such as the roads. What do you think?
I mean, you're absolutely right, and your numbers are almost exactly my rough metric of 80-20. And I think if you look in the public sector, the 20% of the population population who create the most demand for policing are probably also the 20% of people who create the most demand in the NHS, who are also the 20% of people who create the most demand in terms of social services. So we have a small proportion of the population which is high demand in many areas,
yes,
but probably absorbed about 80% of the cost.
Yeah,
I think that's a reasonably well understood ratio. Now, I wouldn't for a moment suggest we simply should abandon that 20% of the population, but we do need to look very carefully about
absolutely
how we manage that and keep those costs contained. But it is mathematically therefore true that 80% of us are only seeing the benefit of 20% of everything we're paying in our taxation, and so we do need, that's the other side of it. It's all very well to say, well, we need to focus on the 20%. We need to understand, well, now for things like potholes, everybody needs our roads to work. Even if you don't drive, you're relying on deliveries, on businesses to serve you, and frankly, the state of our roads is a disgrace, particularly over in Oxfordshire,
yes,
where I've just been driving through today. So there was a real issue about the need to balance that ratio. Now, I would be quite radical on this actually, and it's something I've written about, which is you talked about local income tax. I would change council tax to be a local income tax. Now, there are lots of arguments, I think, about reducing taxation, but what we don't talk enough about is how you tax people.
Yes.
I think that there's lots of bits of national taxation that I would scrap, even if it meant a slight increase in income tax. But a local income tax, I think, is a really interesting idea to look at. Council tax is probably one of the most disliked taxes, simply because it's the only one you actually get a bill for. For most people who pay under PAYE and don't do a tax return, it's the only tax that you pay that you get a bill through the post and you get a direct debit that comes out of your bank account that you actually see the tax leaving your pocket. So firstly, the method is quite painful for a lot of people. And actually, you could save an awful lot on the administration if you said local councils could levy a tax of up to a fraction of a percentage point is probably all it would need to be. And frankly, HMRC have the delivery method for the vast majority of people on PAYE. They can collect the money. They can guarantee that money to local government and simply transfer the cost. You make huge savings.
Because for many people, and I'm of this view, councillors do not have the powers to properly levy. Levy and spend and cut. A very good example is the Reform Party. So, they went round my ward and across the country with the same leaflet with Nigel going, we'll cut your taxes, we'll stop the boats, even though Buckinghamshire's landlocked, and other pledges that they broke. And just saying, I will say this from a non-partisan view, you, whatever party goes in and say, we're going to cut your council tax when statutory duties are going up, It's a lie. And they went into power in Kent County Council, for example, before they imploded, and now there are lots of independent groups, etc. But still, they still run it. They go into the council and say, "Okay, well, the chief exec paid way too much. What do? Pay rise, council tax, again on the leaflet, cut council tax, rose the council tax, but was it 4%?" It's just the reality is, whatever party, if you're going to go in there promising the world, you're not going to deliver it, and you have to be realistic. And that's what I said to residents on the door. And it's not the truth that people want to hear, but it is a fact. And it feels to me, going back to what you were saying about local government reform, the true devolution deal, the true reform is when central government says to councils that you can actually levy your funding, councils can actually have a say in funding. Instead of, for example, Buckinghamshire Council was cut by over £40 million by the government in grants. Other Conservative administrations were cut as well, so they could essentially port barrel the money to failing councils, where they would obviously throw it into a black hole and never see it again. So it seems to me that councillors don't have the powers they should. Yeah, no, I would agree. I think take council tax again. One of the problems with it is you've got a single person living on their own in their family home, which might be too large for them now, and some people think it's a great idea to force them to move because the council tax is so high. I mean, it's not, as a Conservative, forcing people out of their family homes simply because they're large family homes doesn't. I think what's really important is that not only are councils properly funded, but we look at how they're funded, and I think a local council tax, like a local income tax, rather than using the current property-based model, has got a lot to be said for it. I think that does need to be explored because we quite rightly focus on reducing taxes overall. I think that's important, but actually how we tax people also really matters to maintain that consent. Completely agree, Matthew. My final question is, and it's a question I should have asked earlier, but what does the Anglosphere mean to you?
Well, I think there's a real family across the Commonwealth in particular, and you look at that shared history, which I think is really important, and take things that we talked obviously a lot today about the policing model, and the policing model is something that has been exported by Britain across the globe. You can still see in various parts of the Anglosphere the remnants of traditional British policing, which we're very proud of. But then we also do re-import some innovations, which I think is a very healthy sort of ecosystem that operates. And I think I'm right in saying in regulations, one of the recruitment criteria for chief constables is that they've served up to a certain senior rank in at least a Commonwealth force. So you can have someone coming from elsewhere in the Commonwealth to come and be a chief police officer in the Thames in the UK.
And what a fantastic initiative. It's so important to obviously share that, because the Army have a similar system of recruitment across the Commonwealth, which is all to be celebrated. So Matthew Barber, Police and Crime Commissioner for the Thames Valley, thank you for coming on the show.
Great pleasure.
And Godspeed in your work and keeping us all safe.
Thank you.